I engage in many forms of making, so from sculpture to drawing to photography, installation and performance. I do lots of mould making. Screen printing is something that I've learnt recently through doing a week of work experience at Spacecraft studio. So I'm interested in the factory and systems of production, and how the gallery can be, a place of making, and, to reveal a labour process as the artwork itself. So a project back in 2012 called Piecework, I exhibited at Linden in June, and it was selected as part of the Melbourne Prize for Urban Sculpture. So I then exhibited it again at Fed Square later in November of that year, and it was, it consisted of 3 workstations where 3 workers were casting gold bars from plaster moulds and then painting them gold. So this was inside Linden, and then outside at Federation Square in the atrium.
A good starting point, funnily, is to go back a long way to college, because it kind of seems to have been something that I've continued with. And so college was in Bradford in England, and it was an interesting course where it had the theory department at the very heart of the course, and we didn't have any discipline designations before we started the course, so we were all doing fine art, and we had access to all the traditional art college type practices: printmaking, ceramics, glass, textiles, whatever. They were all available to us, but the only difficulty in getting access to these was you had to explain to the theory department why you wanted to go down and work in that department. So initially we did projects like, most art colleges, and if you were doing a project about propaganda and you decided that you wanted to do that through glass drawing and 2D printmaking, they would quiz you on that and you would present to them, and eventually you would get yourself ticked off in the areas that you were allowed to work in, and you would go down and you would say, I'm working on a propaganda project, to the people that were running that department. And it was very liberating for us, and it was also, I think for us, we felt that our practices, although practices like that obviously existed at that time, but not for all the lecturers that were on the courses. So a lot of them were photographers or people who had a notional home base around a particular practice. And so it was it was an interesting kind of starting point, and that was the beginning of my art practice. And for instance, going into printmaking, I found it very it was quite stuffy. The people were wearing, it was a long time ago, this was in the 1980 or something, but the technicians in printmaking were wearing a 3/4 length brown coat and a shirt and tie. And they had a certain way of doing things, as you could imagine, as indicated by their uniforms. And so I find it very hard to work in printmaking and move to textiles, where they also had screen printing. But they were, they weren't dressed in brown coats and shirt and tie. And so they were more liberal about what I might get up to. And that's, so some of the things that have come with me throughout my kind of career in being artist and creative have been sort of bedded down or learned in those early stages, I think. So continuing from that, it was, the artist's life of writing, curating, making when you could, working and at something else, always sort of within the art world. And then eventually had a sort of an idea that I could work in design. And that kind of changed things a little bit for me. It was a sort of pastime for a while, and then moving to Australia, I think I was able to, I don't think I could have done this in London quite as easily, but me being able to sort of make more of a shift and start to make things that were maybe were design rather than just contributing to other people's design practices. So yeah, a bit of an opportunity to sort of realign your CV by moving from one side of the world to the other, and not have the sort of peer pressure of your friends wondering why you're making cushions or something. That would have been hard for me to sort of make that leap when I was in it. But it's just a different relationship with grants and funding and support. And so we set something up here, but just that decision to really get my hands dirty, go onto the high street, jump in and sort of involve yourself in a day, in that day-to-day sort of way with design was an interesting decision, which was the sort of founding of that spacecraft setup. So now we've got this technical core printing to what we do studio-wise, and that seems to lead things towards, flags and things that we're good at making, but not always. I mean, got lots of different collaborative practices and collaborate in lots of different ways. But my favourite collaboration really is the collaboration with Kate Dot, where we imagine ideas around, or have ideas around social justice that we want to turn into art projects, and that they can take whatever form they like. For instance, one was to cast a bell that would only ring once a day at a time that non-clock time, so a time of day called civil twilight end, where the sun is 6 degrees below the horizon line if you're stood on the equator, and it rings 3 times. But we had to cast a bell, and we cast a bell in Castlemaine, and then we had to build a 8-metre bell tower for that to be housed in. So not all around printing and textiles, mostly driven by ideas.
So when was it? I think so. That was.
Yeah, I don't know.
That was last year, the 7th.
Right.
Made, he approached me and said that he's got this idea. Him and you had already discussed ideas about bridging the 2 spaces together. So bus and spacecraft, and he wasn't sure how that would happen. So he approached me and said, in your practice you sort of already, are exploring ideas of a presentation space, so the gallery, and that of a studio, and bring the studio into a gallery space. And we weren't sure how, you guys were talking about some sort of window.
That's right. It certainly wasn't decided whether it was a door or an opening or a window. It was just a breaking through. Immediately,
I wanted to learn how to screen print and bring that into the gallery somehow. I just wanted to extend, one of their working tables and screen print inside the gallery. Love Thy Labour is actually a slogan that I saw from a South African artist, Lawrence Lemoana. So he does produce these large-scale textiles pieces, and Love Thy Labour was one of his artworks, and I thought I'd, appropriate the slogan and use it as, or overlay the text onto an image that depicted work. So the poster's actually of Andy Warhol and his assistant. They're printing on the ground in his factory in the 60s, because I was looking for an image that would be fitting for the site.
Initially, I remember, we were just chatting about expressions of interest and that process that you were going through. And it would have been super casual, nothing written down, thinking, might do something, some ideas that were floating around that might have worked. Then I don't remember exactly, but the notion of the wall came with some other ideas around this building, in particular the relationship that we've got with On Top of the World programme and John Wardle upstairs, and the histories of the site that included the zoning of this part of Collingwood as Business Zone 3, or what used to be Business Zone 3, it's changed name now, and how that Business Zone 3 precludes dense residential projects. So it's a corridor that developers of dense living can't get access to, and it keeps the price of these properties lower, but it also had stimulated, in a very kind of soft planning kind of way, it has stimulated some activities like this building. So John, for example, wouldn't have been able to afford this building if it hadn't existed within the regulations of that Zone 3. It also creates this little corner of producers. So there's a lot of small industry around here that you don't get in other parts. So it's a very kind of quiet bit of planning. We had some talks from Top of the World. We had Robert Nelson come in and give his ideas on planning, which he's coming at it from a non-specialist perspective. That was quite interesting. Nikos Papasturgiadis and architects, etc., joined in with those conversations, and that was interesting for me. Kind of gave me a bit better sense as to when sometimes you don't see planning, but it's there quietly in the background. So it had given me a great love for the building and what the building's been able to achieve, compared with some of the other places that I've rented, where you feel that you it's either forced relationships in some of those sort of modern co-working-y type scenarios, or council run that don't, and I feel that this is a really good model anyway. And to sort of extrapolate on that idea, I thought it might be interesting to knock a hole in the wall. And as you say, to begin with, the logistics of what that hole might be or how it might work within the gallery space were the matter of discussion with Shannon initially. And then anyway, it became a sort of a 3/4, probably even half of a side of an A4 page, submitted almost still in a very casual way, but slightly more formally, as an expression of interest, with a caveat of not quite knowing how it might work, but something along these lines. The wall, the cut as a walk-through wall, then I think that's about the time that it intersects with Maddie saying, "I've got an idea," which was to bring you into the picture. And so that's then the juncture point where these ideas have become more direction to it. So the notion when you came and said I'd like to move the tables into here, then it began to be an idea that we might knock a hole in the wall where the table was and bring the table right through into the gallery space. So that sort of started to firm up some of those senses of how we might be joined. And then we couldn't do that because of the electrics, etc. So we've moved the wall a little bit over to here, and then it all just sort of started to roll as your familiar decision-making processes. Should we do this? Or what would be better? Could we do that? The fact that they had planned to have a door in the area that we opened up. So yeah, rolling from there, and then your wonderful interventions of wanting to come and do work experience, etc. They all kind of made perfect sense. Andy Warhol, great choice, I mean, it's lovely when you describe that as work. I mean, the only thing that feels like work about that is the fact that it's called it a factory somehow. I mean, that it's, that in what, say, printing on the ground, it's a very, very similar size to the print that you've made. So the sense that you can't print it as one person, that you're going to have to pass it from you to somebody else is pretty in the processes of labour or making. And seems to describe almost that passing over between ourselves and Bus in a clever way. And then obviously the title, Love Thy Labour, which would be better understood as Love Thy Neighbour, is smart as well. It's much smarter than my title, which was an opening. And so I've managed to just graft onto the Love Thy Labour and let it sit with the clever title.
Well, doing some days next door and seeing how you guys move and print was, I think, really great. It's been really interesting, and I feel really privileged to have been able to get such an insight into the workings of Spacecraft Studio and how things are made there and then they're presented in their retail space. Well, I've always been interested in the production and process of items or objects, but now I'm sort of thinking of artworks as products. So that's sort of something new, and I don't know how to navigate that yet.
It's really fascinating. I mean, the linkage that I've just sort of realised is that you're interested in production, methodologies, etc. And my fascination was through this interest in popular culture that was very current when I was studying and growing up as an artist. That kind of interest in the rhythms of the high street, but what I kind of enjoyed thinking about and writing about, but when I say getting my hands dirty, they actually becoming part of the high street has been such an interesting thing, and you're almost doing that as well with production. We're part of the linked through that relationship between production and presentation.
I think so my practice, it's a section or a branch, or I'm just thinking of it as an extension of my practice. So I'm treating the textiles, the making of garments or turning materials into garments as an extension of my creative practice. And it's something that I like to explore. I've actually been turning the prints into garments, and I'll just have to see where that leads.
Certainly for me that's been a really fascinating area, and one that all the kind of battles that artists had to fight, that's one of the hardest, I find, you know, the sense of the hierarchy of your sort of fine art production, and trying to tell people that your design might be kind of considered on a level with that. And that, I mean, that hierarchy is a real stumbling block. I mean, some of the smartest people I've ever worked with have been fashion people, but your art friends don't want to hear that. And so it's it's a funny sort of
I just
hierarchy.
wonder what that is. Like, it's...
Don't know, it's a thing though.
Yeah.
No matter whether you kind of, you know, acknowledge, it definitely exists, and makes it difficult to not have a split personality in a way. I think folk find it much easier if they'll either talk about the design work that I do or the artwork, but they don't want to combine the two. Whereas I'd like to combine everything. I think you're teaching the way that I kind of teach, which is not so much anymore, but I used to think that should be in your creative output, and just pretty much list everything that you're doing, you know, the skills that I learned from different projects are used in others, and it's all part of the same thing.
Yeah.
Maybe.